A wealthy and accomplished black man, dressed simply, is wrongfully targeted during a routine traffic stop by an aggressive white police officer fueled by racial bias. The officer's blatant assumptions and abuse of authority escalate as he subjects the protagonist to humiliation and harassment, questioning his right to success and belonging. Despite maintaining composure, the protagonist faces mounting tension, surrounded by a crowd that begins recording the injustice. This intense and infuriating encounter exposes systemic racism in America, revealing how prejudice and power collide in moments that leave lives forever changed. The morning sunlight filtered through the wide windows of Dixon's coffee house, spilling golden light across the honey-hued wooden floors and tabletops. The air was heavy with the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee, cinnamon pastries, and faint traces of newspaper ink. A cozy, unassuming little world on the corner of Roosevelt Avenue. It wasn't flashy, not the kind of place where big names tended to linger, and that was precisely why Justice Michael Grayson liked it. Michael sat at his usual table near the window, a well-worn seat that gave him a view of the street, but kept him away from the center of the room. To anyone who glanced at him, he looked like just another customer. Tall, broad-shouldered, a man in his early 50s with a salt-and-pepper beard trimmed close. His tailored black suit jacket hung neatly on the chair beside him, and the crisp white shirt he wore had its sleeves rolled up to his elbows. There was a humility to his appearance that often made him blend in, even though his reputation spoke volumes in the courts of Chicago. Justice Grayson, Mike, as he preferred to be called by friends, was one of the few black judges appointed to the state Supreme Court in recent years, a milestone in a career that had been paved with hard-earned victories. But titles had never meant much to him. He still lived in the same modest two-story house on the south side, still drove the same car, a 10-year-old Audi, and still spent his free mornings at Dixon's coffee house, sipping his favorite caramel cappuccino while reading case notes. If anyone asked him about his humble lifestyle, he'd just smile and say, "You don't need much when you know what matters." On this particular morning, he was reviewing a particularly thorny case. A class action lawsuit against a real estate developer accused of discriminatory practices had landed on his desk. One that had the potential to blow open decades of unchecked injustice. He read over his notes carefully, pen tapping rhythmically against the paper. His brow furrowed. The numbers are right there, he thought, but no one wants to see them. The bell above the cafe door jingled softly, pulling his focus away. Two men in navy blue suits stepped inside, talking loudly to each other as they approached the counter. Their presence immediately disrupted the calm hum of the room. Both were younger, late 30s, sharp-featured, their polished shoes clicking against the floorboards with an air of entitlement that felt practiced. "Yeah, get me a black coffee," one of them said to the barista, a young black man who wore his name tag, Jamal, pinned crookedly to his apron. "And make it quick, all right? We're on the clock." The other man snorted, elbowing his colleague with a chuckle. "You'll be waiting all day, I swear. Places like this need some actual management." Michael's ears perked at the comment. Though his eyes remained on his papers, his pen stopped tapping. The barista nodded silently, unflustered as he began the order. Michael didn't need to look up to know what those men saw when they stepped inside. A locally owned business in a neighborhood they didn't frequent, and people who, to them, didn't quite belong in their Chicago. The quiet tension in Dixon's was something Michael had grown familiar with over the years. It wasn't loud or confrontational, but it hung in spaces, the way conversations went quiet when someone like him entered a luxury store, or how polite smiles at formal dinners sometimes hardened when his nameplate revealed his title. It didn't matter that he had earned his education at Yale Law, or that he had defended clients who couldn't afford anyone else when he was a young public defender. To some, he'd always be out of place. "Justice Grayson?" The familiar voice of Jamal broke through his thoughts. Michael looked up to find the young barista standing there with his cappuccino. Jamal grinned as he set it down, his movements light despite the weight he surely carried, as a black man working in this part of town. "On the house today, sir," Jamal added softly. Michael's brow quirked as he glanced up at him. "No, you don't have to do that, Jamal." Jamal gave a small shrug. "I insist my brother told me about the hearing you chaired last month, the one about that teacher who got fired. You're out here looking out for folks like us." Michael offered a humble nod, his voice warm but firm. "Well, your brother deserves credit for bringing the case to court. I just made sure someone listened." Jamal smiled gratefully before hurrying back behind the counter. Michael turned his attention back to his notes, but the uneasy murmur of voices from the front of the cafe lingered in the background. The two men, still waiting for their coffee, had taken an interest in him. He could feel their glances, quick, assessing. "What's a guy like that doing here?" one of them muttered, just loud enough to carry. "This neighborhood's really changing." Michael's grip on his pen tightened for a moment, before he forced himself to relax. He'd been in courtrooms where the stakes were life and death, where words could cut far deeper than this casual ignorance. Still, something about the smugness in their tone rankled him. The man with the black coffee turned to face Michael directly, his expression almost playful. "Hey there, sir. You working on something big?" He gestured lazily at Michael's papers. "You a professor or something?" Michael looked up at him, his dark brown eyes calm and steady. "Something like that," he said simply. The man tilted his head, unbothered by the vague response. "Never seen you here before. Surprised someone like you comes to a place like this." "Someone like me," Michael echoed, arching an eyebrow. The man hesitated for just a beat before grinning, though there was no humor behind it. "No offense. Just seems out of place for a guy in a suit. I'm guessing you're not from this neighborhood." Michael held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "Actually, I grew up just 3 streets over. But you're right. I am out of place, sitting here minding my business." The man blinked, clearly unsure of how to respond. The cafe had fallen silent, the quiet hum of voices disappearing like fog. Jamal shot Michael a worried glance, his fingers nervously cleaning the espresso machine. Even the other customers seemed frozen, watching the exchange from the corners of their eyes. The second man, the quieter one, muttered something under his breath, pulling his friend toward the door as soon as their drinks arrived. "Let's go, place isn't worth the fuss." Michael watched them leave without another word, the bell above the door jingling sharply behind them. The tension that had wrapped around the room slowly began to loosen, though it lingered in the way people avoided each other's eyes. Jamal approached the table a moment later, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry about that, Judge Grayson. Some people just don't know how to act." Michael shook his head, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You don't need to apologize for other people's ignorance, Jamal. It's not your burden to carry." Jamal exhaled a quiet breath, nodding gratefully. "Still, it's not right." "No, it's not," Michael agreed softly. As Jamal returned to the counter, Michael took another sip of his cappuccino, letting the tension settle into something quieter, less jagged. It wasn't the first time he'd been spoken to like that, and he knew it wouldn't be the last, but the weight of it always stayed with him, a reminder of just how deep the cracks in the foundation ran. Outside, the traffic on Roosevelt Avenue moved along without pause, unaware of the small, charged moment that had just passed. Michael glanced back down at his notes, his mind returning to the class action case waiting for him. Discriminatory practices, he thought again. It's all connected. He picked up his pen, underlining a sentence with deliberate strokes as the day carried on. Michael Grayson had planned to spend the morning quietly working through his case notes, the noise of Dixon's coffee house, his usual backdrop of comfort. But now the air seemed different. There was an edge to it, a ripple of tension left in the wake of the two men's departure, as though the energy they'd carried with them had lingered like stale smoke. He glanced at his watch. 10:03 a.m. He still had time before his meeting downtown, where he would face the usual maze of voices and agendas. For now, though, he turned his focus back to the papers spread across his table. The facts of the class action case were infuriating in their simplicity. Low-income black families denied leases in upscale developments under flimsy pretenses. What frustrated him more was the lack of attention it had received, even as evidence piled up. It's all connected, he thought again. Michael's concentration broke when the cafe door jangled open. This time, it was a police officer in uniform, broad shoulders, mirrored sunglasses perched on his face. The officer took slow steps into the coffee house, his presence immediately commanding attention. The room, which had just begun to relax, froze once more. Jamal, still at the espresso machine, paused mid-steam, glancing nervously toward Michael before looking away. The officer walked straight to the counter and leaned on it, his voice carrying a little too far. "Morning, everything all right here?" The question wasn't hostile, but something about its delivery rubbed Michael the wrong way. He glanced up, noting how the officer's eyes lingered on him from behind the reflective lenses. "Is this about me?" Jamal blinked, startled. Yeah. Officer, everything's fine." "You sure?" the officer pressed, looking pointedly in Michael's direction. "We got a call about someone acting suspicious in the area. Figured I'd check it out." Michael's jaw tightened, though his face betrayed nothing. Acting suspicious. He knew exactly where this was going before the officer even opened his mouth again. He had seen this play out 100 times. In courtrooms, on sidewalks, in boardrooms where his title alone wasn't enough to strip away assumptions. Jamal, clearly flustered, motioned toward Michael. "I think maybe you mean him Judge Grayson comes in here all the time, sir. He's just working." The officer's head turned sharply toward Michael, as if Jamal's words didn't quite compute. "Judge?" he repeated, the word heavy with skepticism. Michael set his pen down carefully. He met the officer's gaze, or at least where his eyes should have been behind the sunglasses, and spoke in a steady, level tone. "Yes, Michael Grayson, and I'm not suspicious of anything, except maybe overpriced coffee." He tried to infuse the comment with a touch of light humor, but the effort fell flat. The officer didn't laugh. Instead, his lips curled slightly, as if doubting every word. "Mind if I see some ID, sir?" The room seemed to shrink as the words hung in the air. Michael's muscles tensed under the table, though he willed himself to remain composed. It was a calculated demand, polite on the surface but simmering with an implication he couldn't ignore. He could feel the quiet shift in the cafe, the way customers stopped mid-sip or mid-sentence. This was the kind of scrutiny they all knew, but this isn't about them. This is about me. "Is there a reason you're asking for that?" Michael said, his voice even but cool. "Or is this just protocol for a man drinking coffee?" The officer's posture stiffened. His fingers flexed against the counter before he straightened up, his tone shifting. "Look, sir, we got a call, and I'm just doing my job. If you're who you say you are, there shouldn't be a problem, right?" Michael considered the officer for a long moment. There were two choices here, as there always were. Comply and let the situation deflate, or push back and risk escalating the tension. He glanced toward Jamal, who looked ready to disappear under the counter, and sighed softly. Sometimes, you pick the quieter battle. Without a word, Michael reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his wallet. He slid his ID across the table, his movements slow and deliberate, almost a performance. The officer snatched it up, inspecting it as if he expected to find a forgery, though his expression didn't shift. When he finally handed it back, Michael could see the faintest flicker of embarrassment flash across his face. "Everything checks out, Judge," the officer said flatly. "Thanks for your cooperation." Michael accepted his ID with a nod, tucking it back into his wallet. And what about whoever called you? Are they satisfied? The question landed like a stone, drawing an awkward silence. The officer hesitated, clearly unused to being challenged in this way. It was probably a misunderstanding, he muttered. Sorry to bother you. Before Michael could respond, the officer turned and left, his exit punctuated by the sharp jingle of the cafe door. The room exhaled, the tension lifting like steam from a coffee cup, though it left behind a sticky residue. Jamal spoke first, his voice quiet but tense. I'm so sorry, Judge Grayson. That was unnecessary. Michael offered him a small, reassuring smile. You don't need to apologize, Jamal. It's not your doing. Still, Jamal muttered, shaking his head. I hate that it happens. Michael couldn't argue with that. He lifted his coffee, now lukewarm, and took a long sip, gathering his thoughts. Anger simmered just beneath his calm facade. A familiar heat, one he'd spent decades learning to temper. He wanted to believe he could walk into a coffee shop in his own city, dressed as he was, and simply be seen for the man he was. But assumptions ran deep, and changing them was like chipping away at stone. By the time Michael arrived downtown, the echo of the morning's incident still clung to him like a shadow. The courthouse was buzzing as usual, lawyers and clerks scurrying through the halls, the air thick with the smell of paper and strained coffee. He navigated it with the same quiet authority he always did, nodding greetings to those he passed. Morning, Justice Grayson. A young law clerk called cheerfully Michael gave her a warm nod in return. He made his way to his chambers, where his assistant, Felicia, was already waiting with a stack of papers. Felicia, a sharp-witted woman in her 60s who had worked with him for nearly a decade, immediately noticed his stiff posture. Something happened this morning? She asked, narrowing her eyes as she handed him a folder. Michael paused, holding her gaze for a beat. Just the usual coffeehouse drama. Felicia frowned. Don't tell me someone gave you trouble again. You'd think this city would know you by now. You'd think, Michael replied dryly, dropping into his chair. He ran a hand across his beard, exhaling slowly. But you know how it goes. Felicia didn't need further explanation. She'd seen it before, how, despite Michael's status, his presence was often questioned in places where it shouldn't be. She crossed her arms, her tone laced with irritation. People are blind when they want to be. Michael smiled faintly. They are, but we're not here to argue with them. We're here to make sure the system works. Felicia's expression softened. Well, don't let them get in your head, Judge. You've got work to do. Michael nodded, turning his focus back to the case files on his desk. The morning's incident gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside for now. There were more battles to fight, and they weren't won in coffee houses. They were won here, in quiet rooms and courtrooms, through arguments and evidence, through change, even when it came slower than anyone wanted. As he flipped open the file, one thought lingered at the back of his mind. This is far from over. The courthouse was quieter than usual that afternoon. The halls, typically buzzing with hurried voices and brisk footsteps, had a stillness about them. Michael Grayson noticed the shift immediately. It was as if the building itself was bracing for something. Felicia appeared in the doorway of his chambers, clutching a stack of documents tighter than usual. Her face, usually a mask of calm efficiency, held a flicker of unease. Judge Grayson, there's something going on downstairs. Michael raised his head, pen pausing mid-signature. What do you mean? It's... She hesitated, lowering her voice. The courthouse steps. There's a crowd gathering reporters' cameras. I overheard Officer Daniels' name come up. Michael set his pen down carefully. Officer Daniels. So that's where this was going. The traffic stop earlier hadn't been isolated. It had been the start of something, a thread tugged too firmly. Now it was unraveling into something bigger. Who's involved? He asked, rising from his chair. Felicia's brows pinched together. There are rumors flying, sir. Something about a complaint filed against you. An allegation. Michael felt the floor tilt slightly beneath his feet. It didn't show, of course. Years of holding his composure in court had taught him well, but inside, a storm began to churn. What kind of allegation? His voice was steady, but Felicia knew him too well to miss the tension beneath it. Something about improper conduct during an investigation. She waved a hand as though dismissing the absurdity of it. They're fishing. Judge looking for anything they can twist. Michael inhaled slowly, carefully measuring his response. Who's pushing this? I don't know for sure. Felicia's voice softened. But Daniels is making noise, and I don't trust his motives. You know how he operates. Michael did. Officer Daniels had always carried his badge like a weapon rather than a shield, wielding authority with a particular disdain for people who challenged him. He had crossed paths with Daniels years ago, when Michael had ruled against him in a civil rights violation case. It seemed the officer hadn't forgotten. Where's Mitchell? Michael asked, referring to his longtime ally and attorney friend. Felicia tapped her watch. He's on his way. I told him you'd want to see him before whatever this is blows up. Michael nodded, grabbing his coat. Let's go. The steps of the courthouse were chaos. The moment Michael emerged from the building's heavy wooden doors, the sound hit him like a wave. Reporters shouting questions, cameras clicking, the dull hum of a crowd that had gathered to witness a spectacle. He scanned the sea of faces and spotted a cluster of uniformed officers off to one side. Officer Daniels standing at the front like a general leading his troops. Daniels locked eyes with him and smiled. A thin, smug curve of his lips that sent a spike of heat through Michael's chest. This wasn't justice. It was theater. And Daniels was the one scripting the play. Judge Grayson! A reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone toward him. Are you aware of the allegations being made against you? Michael didn't pause, his steps purposeful as he descended the stairs. He could feel Felicia at his side, close enough to anchor him. He could hear more voices rising, snippets of loaded questions thrown like darts. Judge Grayson, did you interfere in a police investigation? Reports are surfacing that you've been under scrutiny. Is it true you've been accused of abusing your authority? Michael stopped at the base of the steps, turning slowly to face the crowd. He didn't raise his voice, didn't let his frustration show in the tight line of his shoulders. Instead, he addressed them with the same steady calm he brought into his courtroom. These are baseless allegations, he said firmly, his voice carrying over the noise. I have nothing to hide, and I will not allow this to detract from the work I do for this community. Officer Daniels stepped forward, deliberately making his presence known. Is that so, Judge? He called out, loud enough to be heard over the murmurs. His tone was oily, laced with mockery. Seems to me you've been getting a little too comfortable making your own rules. Michael turned to face him fully. If you have something to say, Officer Daniels, you know where to find me. My chambers are always open to those seeking clarity. The crowd rippled with curiosity at the exchange. Daniel's smirk faltered for a brief second before he recovered, advancing a few steps closer. Oh, I'll seek clarity, all right, Daniels replied, his voice dripping with smug confidence. We're not finished here. Felicia leaned toward Michael, her voice a low murmur. This is a setup, Judge. He's playing dirty. Michael knew she was right. Daniels was manufacturing a story, sowing doubt and confusion among the public, a carefully orchestrated attempt to discredit him. But why now? Was it retaliation for Michael's past rulings? A grudge resurfacing? Or something bigger at play? Before he could respond, a voice cut through the din. Judge Grayson! Mitchell's familiar baritone carried across the steps, and Michael turned to see him pushing through the crowd. The lawyer looked frazzled, his tie slightly askew, but his face held the same unshakable confidence that had made him one of Michael's closest allies. Mitchell reached Michael's side, glancing briefly at Daniels before lowering his voice. "We need to talk inside now." Michael hesitated, unwilling to let Daniels see even a flicker of weakness. "Not yet." "Michael," Mitchell said, using his first name, a rare occurrence. "There's a warrant for your arrest." The words hit like a punch to the gut, and for a split second, Michael couldn't breathe. Around him, the crowd continued to buzz, oblivious to the weight of what had just been said. He turned to Mitchell sharply. "On what grounds?" Mitchell's face was grim. "Daniels claims he has evidence of obstruction in that class action case you're overseeing. He's tying you to the very investigation you've been fighting for." Michael's blood ran cold. It wasn't enough for Daniels to humiliate him. He wanted to ruin him, to weaponize the system against him in the most public way possible. And suddenly, Michael understood the case, the one he'd spent months building against a discriminatory real estate conglomerate, threatened people like Daniels. People who benefited from the system staying broken. They were pushing back, and they'd chosen him as their target. Officer Daniels' voice rang out again, loud and triumphant. "Judge Grayson, I believe you're familiar with due process. How about you show us what accountability looks like?" The crowd went silent. Michael turned to face Daniels, the officer's smug face a mask of victory. Two other officers flanked him, their hands resting near their belts, as though anticipating trouble. Michael's jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to shout the truth, to expose Daniels for the fraud he was. But another voice, quieter and steadier, rose in his mind. "Be patient. Be smart. This isn't the place." He raised his hands slightly, showing no resistance. "I'll cooperate." Felicia stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't—" "Felicia," Michael interrupted softly. "It's all right." He turned to Mitchell, who nodded with understanding. "I'll be with you every step of the way," Mitchell said firmly. Michael's heart pounded as he felt the officers close in. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed louder than it should have. He kept his gaze steady on Daniels, refusing to give him the satisfaction of looking defeated. "This isn't over," Michael said quietly. Daniels smirked. "Oh, I think it is, Judge." As the officers led Michael toward the waiting patrol car, the crowd erupted, reporters shouting questions, onlookers murmuring in shock. Felicia stood at the base of the stairs, her face pale with fury, while Mitchell hurried to follow them, phone already pressed to his ear. The sun glared harshly as Michael climbed into the car, his wrists burning against the cuffs. Through the window he saw Daniels watching, his expression victorious. For now. Michael turned his gaze forward, his mind already sharpening to a single point. "I will not let this stand." The clang of the cell door echoed through the air, reverberating like a gunshot. Michael Grayson sat on the hard, cold bench in the holding cell, his back straight and hands resting on his knees. His suit, tailored and pristine this morning, now seemed out of place amid the grimy grey walls and the faint stench of stale sweat and disinfectant. The handcuffs had left faint red marks on his wrists. He rubbed them absent-mindedly, his mind a storm of controlled fury. This wasn't just about him anymore. The implications of his arrest were far-reaching. Daniels hadn't just come for Michael's dignity. He'd come for his reputation, his influence, his power to create change. "They want me quiet," Michael thought, "but I won't stay quiet." A loud buzz signaled someone entering the holding area. He looked up, just as Mitchell stormed in, his brown trenchcoat flaring behind him like a cape. A mixture of anger and resolve etched into every line of his face. "Judge Grayson, we're getting you out of here," Mitchell announced, his voice echoing in the otherwise empty space. His words were more for the guards standing nearby than for Michael, a not-so-subtle reminder of who they were dealing with. Michael stood as Mitchell approached the cell bars, lowering his voice. "What's happening?" Mitchell ran a hand over his bald head, his frustration visible. It's worse than I thought. Daniels filed the complaint directly with the DA's office, claiming evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. He's got a couple of rogue officers backing his story. It reeks of a setup, but it's spreading like wildfire. The press is already spinning headlines. Michael's jaw tightened. Evidence tampering. It was the ultimate accusation against a judge, an attack on the very foundation of his integrity. How did they get to the DA so quickly? Mitchell's lips pressed into a thin line. There's political pressure. The timing isn't a coincidence, Michael. Your ruling on the housing case is set for next week, Daniels, and whoever's pulling his strings knew exactly what they were doing. Michael exhaled, his anger simmering. So what's the DA's angle? Do they actually believe this nonsense? Mitchell shook his head. They're not fools. But politics matters more than truth in situations like this. The optics of arresting a sitting judge, especially a black man in your position, it gives them leverage. They'll let you twist in the wind while they decide whether to press charges. Michael turned to face the guards, who were watching them with thinly veiled curiosity. How long do we have? Bail is set. I've got someone at the courthouse processing the paperwork, but Daniels did everything he could to slow it down. Mitchell's voice dropped lower. He wants you to spend as much time in here as possible, to make you look small. The words cut deeper than Michael wanted to admit. Small Daniels didn't just want Michael out of power. He wanted him diminished, stripped of the quiet dignity that had defined his career. Michael stepped closer to the bars, his voice steady and calm. I'm not going to let them win, Mitchell. Mitchell's gaze hardened. Good, because you're going to need every ounce of resolve you've got. Daniels doesn't care about the law. He cares about the story. And right now, he's winning the narrative. Outside the police station, chaos reigned. The air was thick with the flashing of cameras and the shouts of reporters. The crowd had swelled since Michael's arrest, spilling onto the sidewalks and snarling traffic. Protesters waved signs, their voices rising in chants of "Justice for Judge Grayson" and "We see the setup." Michael stepped out of the station, Mitchell at his side. The cameras clicked in a frantic rhythm as reporters descended like vultures, hurling rapid-fire questions. Judge Grayson, do you deny the allegations? Is this the end of your judicial career? Do you plan to step down from the bench? Michael stopped on the steps, raising a hand. The crowd hushed, a tension-filled silence replacing the chaos. He scanned the faces in front of him, reporters, protesters, police officers watching from the sidelines. Somewhere in the crowd, he spotted Daniels, arms crossed, and smug grin firmly in place. Michael's voice rang out, firm and unwavering. I want to make one thing clear. I have done nothing wrong. These accusations are false, and they will not hold up under scrutiny. This is not justice. This is an abuse of power. The crowd rippled with murmurs, a mix of support and curiosity. Daniel's smile faltered just slightly. Michael saw it, like a fissure in a dam, and pressed on. There are those who will use fear and misinformation to undermine the truth. But I will not be intimidated. I will continue to stand for justice, for fairness, and for the people who depend on me to speak for them. A cheer rose from the protesters, loud enough to drown out the cacophony of reporters. Michael turned to Mitchell, who gave him a curt nod of approval. That's enough for now, Mitchell muttered, ushering him toward the waiting car. As Michael climbed in, his eyes found Daniels one last time. The officer met his gaze with a look that was equal parts anger and warning, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his belt. This isn't over, the look seemed to say. But Michael's silent response was clear. No, it isn't. Back in his office that evening, the fight intensified. The desk in Michael's chambers was strewn with papers, legal documents, press clippings, evidence folders, but his mind was laser-focused. Mitchell sat across from him, phone to his ear as he coordinated with contacts across the city. Felicia paced near the window, alternating between sipping coffee and relaying updates from their allies. Protests are spreading, Felicia reported, glancing at her phone. There's a vigil planned outside the courthouse tomorrow night. People are angry. Judge Daniels overplayed his hand. Michael nodded, though his expression remained serious. Anger isn't enough. We need proof. Mitchell hung up the phone, leaning forward. I might have something. An officer, rookie cop, barely a year on the force, was with Daniels during the supposed evidence tampering. He's been quiet so far, but I've got a hunch he's uneasy about the whole thing. Michael's brow furrowed. Does he know Daniels planted evidence? Mitchell shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe he's just seen too much. Either way, I'm meeting him tonight. If he talks, it could blow this whole thing wide open. Felicia set her coffee down with a thud. And if he doesn't? Mitchell looked at Michael, his expression grave. Then we keep fighting with what we have. Michael exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Daniels wants me to lose control, he said quietly. To lash out, to make mistakes. That's how he wins. Felicia's voice softened. But you won't. You're smarter than he is. Michael looked up, meeting her gaze. I have to be. Later that night, the office was dark except for the soft glow of Michael's desk lamp. The courthouse was silent now, the echoes of the day fading into stillness. Michael sat alone, reviewing the files Mitchell had left for him, when a faint knock broke the quiet. The door creaked open, and a young officer stepped inside. He was barely more than a kid, early 20s, with nervous eyes and a badge that looked too big for his uniform. You're Officer Hale, Michael said, recognizing him from one of Mitchell's descriptions. The young man nodded, glancing over his shoulder as though checking for shadows. Yes, sir. Michael set his pen down, watching him carefully. You have something to tell me. Hale swallowed hard, stepping closer. It's about Daniels. What happened? The evidence. It wasn't real. He planted it. Michael's pulse quickened, though his face remained calm. Are you sure? Yes. Hale's voice shook slightly. I saw him drop the bag. I didn't say anything then because You were afraid, Michael finished for him. Hale nodded, his eyes downcast. I didn't sign up for this, Judge. I didn't sign up to ruin people's lives. Michael stood, walking around the desk to place a steadying hand on Hale's shoulder. You did the right thing coming here. This isn't just about me. It's about fixing what's broken. Hale looked up, relief warring with fear in his expression. What happens now? Michael's jaw tightened, resolve hardening in his chest. Now we fight back. Cliffhanger setup. As Officer Hale leaves, Michael watches him disappear into the dark hallway. Mitchell bursts into the office moments later, out of breath, phone in hand. Michael, we've got a problem. Michael's gaze sharpens. What is it? Mitchell holds up his phone. Daniels knows about Hale. They're coming for him. We need to move. Now. The courthouse lobby was filled with an uneasy hum. Late evening shadows stretched long across the marble floor, and muted conversations between clerks and security echoed softly against the high ceilings. Michael Grayson stood in the center of it all, calm and immovable, though every fiber in his being was bracing for the storm ahead. Beside him, Mitchell clutched a folder stuffed with Hale's statement, voice recordings, and corroborating evidence. He looked around nervously, scanning for any sign of Officer Daniels or his men. Hale's on his way here now, Mitchell muttered under his breath. We just need him to sign the affidavit, and this thing blows open. Michael nodded, but said nothing. His mind was already 2 steps ahead. He knew Daniels wouldn't take this quietly. There was too much at stake, for Daniels, for the system that enabled him. The real fight was still to come. The glass doors swung open with a bang. Officer Daniels strode into the courthouse like a man marching into enemy territory, his boots echoing sharply as he crossed the marble. Flanking him were two other officers, bigger, meaner-looking than Daniels, their expressions blank, but eyes sharp. The small crowd of clerks and late-working attorneys scattered instinctively, sensing the tension in the air. Daniels' gaze locked on Michael immediately. His smirk curled like a snake, venom dripping from his words before he even reached earshot. "Well, well, Judge Grayson. Always so composed it's almost impressive," Daniels drawled, stopping a few feet away. His voice carried a casual cruelty that grated against the stillness of the room. "Too bad composure won't save you tonight." Michael's expression didn't waver. "You shouldn't be here, Daniels. There's no jurisdiction for whatever stunt you're trying to pull." Daniels' smirk widened. "Oh, I'm not here on official business, Judge. I'm just here to observe. After all, I hear you've been dragging some good men's names through the mud." "My men." He glanced pointedly at Mitchell's folder. "Seems to me you're grasping at straws." Mitchell stepped forward, his voice sharp. "We have a sworn statement from one of your own officers, rookie or not, Hale's testimony." "Where is he then?" Daniels cut him off, his voice dripping with derision. "If this is such an airtight case, why don't I see your star witness?" Michael's eyes narrowed. "Hale will be here." For a split second, something flickered in Daniels' expression, an almost imperceptible twitch of concern. Then, it was gone, replaced by cold malice. He stepped closer, closing the space between them until they were nearly eye to eye. "You really think you can take me down?" Daniels hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're untouchable because you sit on some cushy bench handing out verdicts? You don't know how this works. Grayson, men like me don't lose." Michael held his ground. "Men like you have been winning for far too long. That ends tonight." The crowd watching from the sidelines grew silent, their attention frozen on the two men. Daniels' cocky veneer cracked, replaced by simmering anger. He leaned in closer, his voice a sharp whisper only Michael could hear. "You don't get it, do you? You're a symbol, Grayson. You in that judge's robe, walking around like you're better than the rest of us. You think you've won just because you've climbed higher. You're still nothing. Just a man in a suit pretending he's something more." Michael's fists clenched at his sides, but his voice remained steady. "And what are you, Daniels? A man who bullies and cheats his way into power. A man so afraid of accountability that you'd rather destroy someone than face the truth." Daniels' face darkened, his confidence faltering. "Watch yourself." "I've been watching," Michael shot back, his voice rising just enough to carry. "I've been watching men like you hide behind a badge while you tear down the very people you claim to protect. I've watched you abuse your power, plant evidence, intimidate witnesses, because you think no one can touch you." Michael stepped forward, his calm presence commanding the room. Daniels instinctively took half a step back, his composure cracking further. "But here's the truth, Daniels. Your time is up. People are watching. And this," Michael gestured around them, "this doesn't end in some quiet back room where you control the rules. It ends out there in the light." Daniel's fists clenched, his breathing growing heavier. "You don't know what you're starting, Grayson." Michael held his gaze. "I know exactly what I'm starting." At that moment, the courthouse doors swung open again, and Officer Hale stumbled in, flanked by two members of Mitchell's legal team. He looked pale and nervous, but resolute. Hale's arrival drew a ripple of murmurs from the onlookers, who sensed a turning point. Daniels turned, his face pale with rage. "What the hell is this?" Hale stopped a few feet away, clutching a signed document in his trembling hand. "It's the truth, sir," Hale said, his voice shaky but clear. "I saw what you did. You planted that evidence to frame Judge Grayson." Daniels turned on Hale like a predator cornering its prey. "You shut your mouth. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Hale's hands shook, but he didn't back down. I'm doing what's right. Mitchell stepped forward, holding up the affidavit triumphantly. This is Hale's sworn statement, corroborated and signed. We've got it all, Daniels, the truth. And this time, you won't be able to bury it. Daniels' face was white with fury. He looked around at the growing crowd, clerks, reporters, and other onlookers, all with their phones out, recording. There was nowhere for him to hide. You're finished, Michael said, his voice quiet but firm. You'll answer for everything you've done. For a long moment, Daniels said nothing. Then, with a growl of frustration, he spun on his heel and shoved through the crowd, heading for the doors. His footsteps echoed in the silence, the sound of a man realizing his reign was crumbling. The crowd erupted into hushed murmurs, the energy electric. Mitchell turned to Michael, his grin wide with relief. We did it, Judge. This changes everything. Michael nodded, though his expression was somber. It's not over yet. Cliffhanger set up. Outside, the night air was cool, but Michael barely felt it as he stepped into the courtyard. Mitchell was on his phone, coordinating next steps. Hale stood nearby, his nerves still visible, but his shoulders straighter than before. Suddenly, a black SUV screeched to a halt on the curb. Michael turned just as two shadowy figures stepped out, their movements quick and deliberate. For a heartbeat, the world slowed. Hale! Michael shouted. But it was too late. The figures lunged for the young officer, grabbing him roughly by the arms and dragging him toward the vehicle. Hale struggled, shouting for help, but the men shoved him into the back seat. Stop! Michael yelled, running forward. The SUV's tires screeched as it sped away into the night, leaving Michael and Mitchell standing in stunned silence. Mitchell's face paled. They took him. Michael's jaw tightened, his mind racing. Then we get him back. The courthouse parking lot was eerily silent, lit only by the flickering glow of streetlights and the red haze of taillights disappearing into the distance. The black SUV that had abducted Officer Hale was gone, swallowed into the night. Michael stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing on his chest like a vice. Mitchell's voice broke the silence, frantic and breathless. What just happened? They just took him. Michael's face was set in stone, his jaw tight. They're tying up loose ends. Mitchell turned toward him, eyes wide with panic. Hale was our star witness. If something happens to him, nothing will happen. Michael cut in sharply, his voice unshaking, a command more than a promise. Because we're going to find him. Mitchell blinked, stunned by the unwavering resolve in Michael's voice. What are we supposed to do? Call the cops. They are the cops. Michael didn't hesitate. Call Detective Alvarez. He's one of the few we can trust. Tell him what happened, and tell him to meet us at the precinct. Mitchell swallowed hard, fumbling for his phone as he turned away. Michael stepped closer to his car, his mind racing. His instincts, sharp and honed from years in the courtroom, told him that Daniels was desperate now. Desperation made men sloppy, and sloppy men made mistakes. He started the engine and glanced toward the passenger seat where Mitchell climbed in, pale but determined. As Michael pulled onto the road, the only sound was the hum of the engine and the faint vibration of Mitchell's tapping fingers against his phone. Then Mitchell broke the silence. Where are we going, Judge? Michael's eyes narrowed at the dark road ahead. To finish this. The confrontation. The precinct loomed ahead, its cold brick facade darkened by night. When Michael and Mitchell stepped inside, the air was heavy with tension. Most of the desks sat empty, save for a few officers who watched them pass with guarded expressions. Michael walked with purpose, his shoulders back, his suit immaculate despite the chaos swirling around him. He was a judge, a man who knew his power and was prepared to wield it. At the far end of the station, Officer Daniels stood beside his desk, speaking quietly to two other officers. Daniels turned, his expression darkening, when he spotted Michael striding toward him like a force of nature. "You've got some nerve walking in here, Grayson," Daniels said, his voice carrying the sting of venom. Michael didn't slow his pace, stopping only when he was a few feet away. "Where is Officer Hale?" Daniels smirked, crossing his arms. "Haven't seen him. Maybe he decided he didn't want to be part of your little charade anymore." Michael's gaze was steely, unwavering. "I know you took him, Daniels. I know you're desperate to bury the truth, but it's too late. Your lies are unraveling, and I'm here to make sure every thread comes undone." Daniels's smirk faltered, a flicker of something dark and dangerous flashing in his eyes. "You think you're the hero in this story? You think standing here pointing fingers makes you powerful?" "I don't think I'm powerful," Michael said, his voice low but cutting like glass. "I know I am." Daniels stepped closer, his face mere inches from Michael's. "You're a fool. Grayson men like me are the law. You think your title makes you untouchable. You're just another man who's gotten too comfortable in a place he doesn't belong." Michael's fists clenched at his sides, but he refused to let Daniels see the anger boiling in his chest. "I've heard enough from men like you my entire life. You're not law, you're fear, you're corruption. You're what happens when people stop holding the system accountable." Daniels's expression turned from smug to dangerous, his voice dropping to a growl. "You don't know when to quit, do you? I can make your life a living hell." Michael stepped even closer, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And I can make sure your career ends in handcuffs and disgrace." For a split second, the two men stood there, locked in an unspoken war around them. Officers had paused, watching nervously from the corners of the room. The tension was thick enough to choke. Then, Daniel's lips curled into a dangerous smile. "You're out of your depth." Michael lifted his chin. "Funny, I was just about to say the same thing to you." Before Daniels could reply, the front doors burst open, and Detective Alvarez entered, flanked by two state investigators. Alvarez's gaze swept over the scene, landing on Michael and Daniels. "Judge Grayson," Alvarez said, his voice steady but urgent. "We've got Hale. He's safe. Your office just filed the affidavit with the DA's office." Daniels stiffened. "What are you doing, Alvarez? This isn't your case." "Not anymore," Alvarez shot back. "The state's involved now. We've got enough evidence to open a full investigation into your actions, Daniels. I suggest you think carefully about what you do next." For the first time, Daniels looked cornered, like a wild animal with nowhere to run. His face twisted with anger as he turned back to Michael. "You think this ends here? You have no idea what you're up against?" Michael's expression was unshakable. "And you have no idea what's coming for you." The room was silent except for the faint sound of footsteps as Alvarez moved toward Daniels. "Hand over your badge and weapon," Alvarez ordered. Daniels stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. His gaze flicked between Alvarez and Michael, as if calculating his next move. For a moment, it seemed like he might resist. But finally, he reached for his belt, unhooked his badge, and slammed it onto his desk with enough force to make it rattle. "This isn't over!" Daniels spat, his voice trembling with rage. Alvarez didn't flinch. "It is for tonight." Daniels turned toward Michael one last time, his expression etched with loathing. "You're going to regret this." Michael didn't blink. "The only thing I regret is not stopping you sooner." With that, Daniels stormed past, shoving his way through the station's doors and disappearing into the night. The sound of the doors slamming shut echoed through the room, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The unresolved moment. As Alvarez turned to give instructions to the state investigators, Mitchell exhaled a shaky breath, his hands trembling. "We did it. We really did it." Michael nodded slowly, but his eyes were fixed on the doors where Daniels had disappeared. His gut told him this wasn't over. Men like Daniels didn't go quietly. They fought back, clawing and grasping at every inch of power they could hold. "This isn't the end," Michael murmured, half to himself. Mitchell turned toward him, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean Daniels is done?" Michael's gaze hardened. Daniels was the symptom, not the disease. The system that created him is still here, and it won't change without a fight. Outside, a rumble of thunder rolled across the darkened sky, as though the heavens were bearing witness to the storm yet to come. Michael's mind was clear, his resolve stronger than ever. The real battle was just beginning. The morning sun broke through the heavy clouds, a muted gold painting the city as though the world itself was exhaling after the storm. News vans parked outside the precinct, reporters milling around with microphones and cameras aimed at the building's cold brick facade. Headlines already blared on phone screens. Corruption exposed in local police department. Judge Michael Grayson takes a stand, and officer suspended amid allegations of abuse. Inside, Michael Grayson sat in a small, sparsely furnished conference room. The hum of voices beyond the walls felt distant, muffled by the heavy doors. A fresh cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him, steam rising in ghostly spirals. His reflection stared back at him in the blackened screen of his phone. Exhaustion etched lines on his face, the weight of the past 48 hours evident in his slumped shoulders. And yet, beneath the fatigue was something stronger: resolve. He had faced the monster, unmasked its lies, and forced it into the light. The door creaked open, and Detective Alvarez stepped in, a folder clutched under his arm. "Judge Grayson," he greeted, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and weariness. "I've just spoken with the DA's office." Michael straightened in his seat. "And?" Alvarez exhaled, dropping the folder onto the table and pulling out a sheaf of papers. "Officer Daniels has been formally suspended pending a full investigation. The footage from the parking lot, along with your affidavit, Officer Hale's statement, and Mitchell's testimony, was enough to trigger immediate action." Michael's lips twitched into a small, hard smile. "Good." "It's not over yet," Alvarez added, his brow furrowing. "Daniels has friends, people in high places. They're going to push back, muddy the waters, do whatever they can to protect him." Michael's expression didn't waver. "Let them try." Alvarez met his gaze, something like admiration flickering in his tired eyes. Most people would have backed down. Judge walked away. "Most people don't have a choice," Michael said quietly. "They don't have the title or the voice to fight back without losing everything I do. It's my job to make sure their voices are heard too." Alvarez nodded, his respect palpable. "For what it's worth, you've got allies now. More than you think. Daniels might have been untouchable before, but he crossed too many lines. There's no hiding what he's done." Michael leaned back in his chair, a deep breath escaping his lungs. For the first time in days, the tightness in his chest seemed to loosen. The battle wasn't over. The system was still cracked, still flawed. But today, a small piece of justice had been restored. The fallout. Outside the precinct, the media buzzed like flies. When Michael finally emerged with Mitchell by his side, they were met by a crush of cameras and voices. "Judge Grayson, Judge Grayson!" a reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone toward him. "What can you tell us about the investigation into Officer Daniels?" Michael paused on the steps, looking out at the sea of faces. His voice was steady, clear. "What happened here over the last 2 days is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern. A pattern of abuse, corruption, and unchecked power. That ends now." The crowd murmured, scribbling notes and recording every word. "Officer Daniels will face the consequences of his actions," Michael continued. "But this isn't just about one man. It's about accountability. It's about a system that must do better. I intend to ensure that it does." Mitchell clapped a firm hand on Michael's shoulder as they pushed through the crowd and headed toward Michael's car. Hell of a speech, Judge, he said with a grin. I think you might have just started something bigger than you realized. Michael glanced at him, his smile faint but full of purpose. Good. Protagonist's growth. That evening, Michael sat in his quiet office at home. The window overlooked the city skyline, its glass towers shimmering against the purpling dusk. His wife, Lauren, entered quietly, setting a steaming mug of tea on his desk before slipping onto the couch nearby. Long day? She asked softly. Michael turned to look at her, his features softening for the first time. Long week. She smiled knowingly. I saw the news. Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand across his jaw. I didn't expect it to go this far. I thought it would just be another case of shouting into the void. But it wasn't, Lauren said, her voice firm. You were heard. You made them listen. Michael looked out the window, his thoughts drifting. I just did what needed to be done. She stood, walking over to him and resting a hand on his shoulder. And that's exactly why it mattered. For the first time, Michael allowed himself to feel it, to absorb the magnitude of what had happened. He had walked through the fire, but he hadn't burned. He had fought for something bigger than himself, and in doing so, he'd reminded others of their power to stand up too. Systemic change. The fallout spread like ripples in water. Officer Daniel's suspension was the first domino to fall. Investigators unearthed other reports. Hidden complaints, buried evidence, all tied back to the same corrupt network Daniels had operated in. News stations ran nightly specials exposing systemic abuses, sparking outrage and renewed calls for reform. Community leaders held meetings. Protests filled the streets. Not angry chaos, but peaceful, determined calls for justice. Signs bore messages like, accountability is not optional, and we will not be silent. In courtrooms and precincts across the city, people began to speak up. Officers who'd once turned a blind eye started reporting misconduct. Citizens who feared retaliation found their courage. The tide was shifting. Michael watched it all unfold, knowing that while change would be slow, it was happening. The unfinished work. A week later, Michael stood before a packed room at City Hall, addressing a crowd of activists, officials, and reporters. The air buzzed with anticipation as he gripped the sides of the podium. This fight isn't over, Michael said, his deep voice reverberating through the room. The events of the past week have shown us the cracks in the system, but we cannot stop at identifying the problem. We must fix it, together. He looked out at the crowd, spotting familiar faces, community organizers, police officers who had stood with him, citizens who'd written letters of support. I am committed to ensuring that accountability becomes the standard, not the exception, Michael continued. This isn't about punishing individuals. It's about creating a system that serves everyone with fairness and integrity. The room erupted into applause, but Michael knew it wasn't for him. It was for the hope of a better future, one where stories like his wouldn't need to be told anymore. Emotional closure. That night, Michael sat on the living room floor with Lauren and their 2 young sons, who clambered around him with giggles and laughter. The heaviness of the week seemed to melt away in the warmth of their shared joy. Daddy, are you famous now? His youngest asked, climbing into his lap. Michael chuckled, pulling the boy close. Something like that. His oldest grinned proudly. You're a hero, Dad. Michael's smile softened as he kissed his son's forehead. I just did what was right. That's what matters most. Lauren watched them, her eyes shining as she rested her head against his shoulder. You made a difference, Michael. Michael nodded, holding his family close. We all did. Outside, the city pulsed with life, different, perhaps only slightly, but better. It was a small victory, but it was enough for now. Change, after all, started with a single voice, a single act of courage, and there was still so much work to do. The city felt different now. Not in its skyline, or the constant hum of life on its streets, but in something deeper. Its pulse. Change doesn't come all at once. Michael Grayson knew that it happens in ripples. Small moments that build, stretch outward, and touch places you never thought they would reach. Sitting at his desk on a quiet evening, Michael turned a silver pen in his hands, a gift from Mitchell, engraved with 3 simple words. Justice takes courage. He had spent his career defining justice in courtrooms, through rulings and arguments that often felt disconnected from the people they served. But the last week had changed something in him. For the first time, justice felt real tangible. It was no longer about abstract laws or debates. It was about people, voices that had been ignored, lives disrupted or destroyed by systems that were supposed to protect them. He leaned back in his chair, the creak of the old wood filling the stillness of his office. Outside the window, the city sprawled before him, alive and restless. He thought about the fight he had stepped into, about Officer Daniels and the men like him who had hid behind badges to wield power as a weapon. Daniels might be suspended. But Michael understood this was only the beginning. Growth and resolve. Michael's personal journey had started quietly, with a simple errand and an unjust assumption. He had been mistaken, first for a man who didn't belong, then for someone who could be silenced. He had played the role society expected of him for so long. Calm, composed, unshakable. A black man who had climbed to the very top but never asked too many questions, never rocked the boat. But when the world tried to diminish him, to make him small, he had been forced to ask himself, what good is power if you don't use it to make a difference? What good was his voice if he didn't speak for those who couldn't? In the face of Daniel's corruption and the system that enabled him, Michael had chosen not to step back. Instead, he had leaned in. He stood up when it was easier to sit down. And in doing so, he found something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Freedom. The freedom to speak. The freedom to fight. The freedom to demand better. This fight had tested him, stripped him of his carefully constructed armor, and revealed something stronger underneath resilience integrity. A fire that wouldn't be put out. And he wasn't done yet. A broader struggle. The events that unfolded had been about more than one man's confrontation with a corrupt officer. Michael had realized that Daniels was a symptom of something much larger, an unchecked system that too often protected its own at the cost of justice. He thought of the faces in the crowd, the people who had gathered outside the courthouse to bear witness. They weren't just angry. They were tired. Tired of being silenced. Tired of being afraid. For Michael, Daniels represented every moment someone had been stopped because they didn't look like they belonged. Every voice dismissed as too loud. Every child forced to grow up too soon, learning the silent, invisible rules of survival. It wasn't just his fight. It was their fight, the communities, the nations. It was about what justice should mean and who it should serve, the seeds of change. In the days that followed, Michael saw the ripples of his stand take shape. Daniels was no longer untouchable. His suspension had sent shockwaves through the department, triggering new conversations about accountability. Michael had been contacted by community organizers, journalists, and young lawyers who saw in his story a spark of hope. City Hall had announced a review of policing practices, pledging to revisit cases that had been buried and address complaints that had gone unheard. It was a small step, symbolic perhaps, but it was a step people were watching. They were paying attention. More importantly, they were speaking up. Michael thought of Mitchell, the security guard who had stood with him despite his fear of Officer Hale, who had risked her position to tell the truth. They, too, were part of this movement. Ordinary people who had chosen to act. Change, Michael realized, didn't come from heroes. It came from moments like those small acts of courage that, together, moved mountains. A message of hope. That evening, Michael joined his family on their front porch. Lauren sat beside him, her presence a steady comfort, as their two sons played on the grass with carefree abandon. The air smelled of rain, cool and cleansing, as if the world itself had hit reset. "Daddy!" his youngest called out, holding a toy airplane high in the air. "Can you watch me fly?" Michael smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "I'm watching, buddy." The boy sprinted across the yard, his laughter ringing out into the evening. Michael's oldest son climbed onto the porch and perched next to him. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice tinged with curiosity, "why did that man think you didn't belong?" Michael's smile faltered slightly, but he placed a hand on his son's back. "Because sometimes people don't see us for who we really are. They see what they want to see." "Like a bad guy?" "Sometimes, yes," Michael admitted. "But it doesn't mean we stop being who we are. We keep going. We keep showing them what's right." His son thought about this for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "Did you win, Dad?" Michael glanced at Lauren, her soft smile encouraging him, then looked back at his son. "Winning doesn't always mean everything gets fixed right away," he said gently. "But we showed people that they can't treat us that way anymore. That's a start." The boy nodded, satisfied with the answer, and scampered off to join his brother. Michael turned his gaze back to the horizon, his thoughts quiet but resolute. For all the hurt and injustice he had faced, there was still hope. A belief that things could change if enough people were willing to stand up, speak out, and demand better. And in this small moment of peace, surrounded by his family and the quiet hum of life moving forward, Michael felt a profound sense of clarity. The fight wasn't over, but they weren't fighting alone anymore. The final reflection. Michael Grayson's story wasn't about one man winning a battle. It was about the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. It was about resilience in the face of injustice, courage in the face of fear, and the belief that speaking up matters, even when the odds are against you. The events that transpired exposed cracks in a system many were too afraid to challenge, but they also revealed something far more powerful: the collective strength of a community that refused to be silent. People like Michael, Mitchell, and Officer Hale had proven that change starts not with grand gestures, but with simple, unrelenting acts of courage. This story is a reminder to all of us. Progress is possible, but it requires us to stand together, to speak when it's uncomfortable, to fight when it's hard to believe, even in the darkest moments, that the light is worth reaching for. Because justice, real justice, takes courage. The evening sky darkened, stars beginning to prick the canvas of the night, and Michael stood with Lauren at his side. Together, they watched their sons play, their laughter carrying on the breeze. It was just the beginning, but beginnings, Michael knew, were the most important part of any story. And this one wasn't over yet.